Let's take a look at an assignment you completed last week when we were covering the formation through translation of the Old Testament across thousands of years of time. Remember, we looked at what is understood to be the earliest known record of the written stories of the Hebrew Bible. Those are known as the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found back in the 1940s by a poor shepherd. From there, we went to looking at the Greek translation of those Hebrew Bible stories. This was the text that Jesus was reading as a young Jew, as a young boy. The Septuagint is what that was called. And then we went on looking at the first Latin translation of the Bible by St. Jerome in the 4th century. We looked at a German translation. We looked at the first ever mass-produced translation of the Bible, known as the Gutenberg Bible, because it was produced by a printing press invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the 16th century. Then we went on to look at what is known as the first ever English translation of the Bible, the Old and New Testament, known as Wycliffe's Bible, and that was in the 1600s. So with that in mind, we then moved on to understanding a bit more about the original language the Hebrew scriptures were written in, the Hebrew language. So you understood Hebrew as a language that sounds, number one, very different from English. Number two, the way it's written. Hebrew is written without vowels. There's also been significant changes between ancient spoken Hebrew and modern spoken Hebrew, also in terms of how it's written. And then you understood Hebrew as a language that's read from right to left. Us English speakers read from left to right. So getting all of these understandings of the Hebrew Bible, you were tasked with deciphering this poem. So this poem, Hebrew, by Jessica Reynolds Shaver. So I'm going to walk you through the translation of it, and then I'm going to walk you through a few of your responses and reflections following the challenge of this deciphering. So here we go. Hebrew by Jessica Reynolds Shaver. The alphabet is hard to master. Reading back to front's disaster. Unless he's read the classifieds, those used to be in the newspaper, you don't have those anymore, where truth abbreviated hides, the would-be reader of the Bible presented with the text is liable to turn and run with shrieks, not sharks, and howls. The Hebrew scriptures have no vowels. Okay, so plenty of you reflected on the fact that this was a challenge, that this was hard. It's not easy interpreting and deciphering even a poem in English that doesn't include vowels. Then you were thinking about, okay, this is in English. The original written scriptures were in Hebrew without vowels, read right to left. So here's some good kind of conclusions you all came to. So this student mentioned deciphering the poem was very tricky, even though it was in English. I couldn't imagine translating a whole other language and deciphering like they did back then. During this process, it definitely could have had words lost or mistranslated. Okay, so the student is getting a good glimpse at how challenging it is to do this in English, and then realizing redactors and authors back then were translating into a new language scripture and stories that were sacred that they didn't want to alter, but necessarily had to, because this new language and this new people and this new community and time that they're living in requires them to understand these stories in a new language, in a new context. Okay, so next up, after deciphering the poem, I can relate to what kind of struggle people went through in the past to translate the Bible from Hebrew to English. Though it's not as difficult as it was then, I can still guess that there were a few mistakes made because of the translation. Again, the student's getting an understanding that the text we have in front of us now probably is a little bit different in terms of the word choice, the organization of how these stories are written down. All of these small but important aspects of how the Bible is presented to us today has gone through significant changes compared to how it was initially presented on paper or papyrus in the Dead Sea Scrolls 4,000 years ago. So this activity helped me understand that as the sacred scriptures developed over thousands of years, translating it may have been risky, as translators did not want to mess up a phrase or page, which could give it a wrong message or a different meaning. Good. The changes over time may have had their messages evolve into things we may relate to. Okay, so this last part, this is a very important reflection. The changes over time in new languages and for new communities of people, they reflect how authors and how redactors wanted to keep the initial intent of these stories from the beginning as true as they could. But to get new people and new communities into translating the power of these stories for themselves and in their own context, the messages evolve for new times. And that's kind of what we do today as well. We want to look at these old stories, but we want to understand them, and we want to relate them as best we can to our lives. And the translation of the Bible goes hand in hand with that. Okay, sophomores, what we're looking at today is an Old Testament timeline. On this timeline, you see a series of events, you see dates, you see the eras or time in between specific dates and what happened or how they're named in terms of the biblical narrative. What I've put on top of this relates back to what you learned on Monday regarding the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Scriptures. The T in Tanakh stands for Torah, the N stands for Nevi'im, and the K stands for the Ketuvim. Each collection of these books includes different sets of history, different sets of literary forms, and different authors. So if we go back really quick, here is a glimpse, schematic, at how the Tanakh is divided and the specific books included. So in the Torah, we have Genesis to Deuteronomy, and we have the initial history of the Old Testament. The first history, or what is called prehistory, the creation, and the era of the patriarchs. That is Abraham, that is Isaac, that is Jacob. And we have history leading up to the Exodus, where the Israelites are leaving Egypt with the direction of Moses. We have the entrance they make into the Promised Land, being led by Joshua. So after that, so we covered Torah. We have this collection of books known as the Nevi'im, or the prophets. There are plenty of prophets that, as we can see on this timeline, lived and worked over a nearly 1,000-year period of the Israelite people. So we're here around the 15th century BC, and the post-exilic period, the Second Temple era that we'll talk about regarding the history of the Israelites. Historians believe ended around the 5th century BC. What we're looking at now is going to raise a few questions, raise a few ideas or points of reflection regarding the formation of the scriptures. Why? Okay, number one, if you look at the circled books, they're circled in purple, those are the books of the Ketuvim. What are you noticing about what you know regarding the collection of books of the Torah, collection of books in the prophets? The first takeaway that we can gather from this timeline regarding the formation of the scriptures is that the books of the Old Testament are not entirely organized chronologically. That is, in terms of how they're ordered and what took place in history from beginning to end. If we look at this man named Job here, there's a book of Job included in the Ketuvim collection of books. Historians of the Bible and Middle Eastern scholars and scripture scholars believe that the book of Job reveals a character that most likely lived at the same time of Abraham. Now you may ask yourself, well, why isn't the book of Job included in the collection of books within the Torah? Well, just because there's a character in a book that may be the main subject of the book or the main subject matter of the story doesn't end up in the Old Testament being placed exactly when he or she lived. The same goes with our analysis of the prophets and how there are most likely prophets or poetry, wisdom books that are organized in the Bible not according to their historical chronology, but according to how authors and redactors of the scripture placed them. Okay, so that's the first takeaway. Okay, so the second takeaway from this video that each of you need to write down is this. The editors, the authors, the writers of sacred scripture throughout time, especially following the life of Jesus later on, we're dealing with multiple sources of sacred scripture, multiple sources of text to collect and create the order of books that we currently have in our Bible. Now, this is difficult for us to understand because we haven't yet looked at the evidence of this taking place in Scripture. But the second takeaway of this video is for you to be aware that the redactors and editors of this Scripture throughout thousands of years of time were dealing with multiple sources, multiple stories of the same individuals, multiple people's perspectives of the same stories, and collecting them together, organizing them together to put the anthology of books we have in front of us in the Old Testament today, to put them together. Okay, the last point each of you needs to record in your notes from today's instruction is where we will end up at the end of Unit 1. So where are we going from here in Unit 1? Our first unit is titled, What is Scripture? And we've looked at the formation of Scripture across time. We've looked at its translations. We've looked at the possibility for how the script and how the stories have adapted or changed slightly over time for new people, for new identities and new languages across human history. We are finishing Unit 1 with our first glimpse at actual Scripture reading. Actual reading of Scripture from the beginning of a story to the end of a story. In this case, the book of Genesis. Okay, so now that I have this zoomed in, you're looking at what is understood as the era of the patriarchs taking place during the book of Genesis, around 4,200 years ago. Remember, this is 2200 BCE. So we're going to be looking at the prehistory or the creation story of the world in the first couple chapters of Genesis. We're going to be analyzing it. We're going to be looking at the possible multiple sources that were put together to create the story by biblical redactors and editors. And we're going to be looking at the patriarchs themselves, the first individuals in what would become the nation Israel, whom God chose to create this covenant with. Those individuals would be Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We'll also look at the life of, or the story of Noah and the Great Flood prior to Abraham. But the patriarchs are understood to be the first individuals God chose to create his people and his promised land for. And that concludes Unit 1. As soon as we're done with the first book of the Bible, known as Genesis, we will be finished with Unit 1. And that is the last takeaway of this video. Okay.